are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors.
Welcome to the Timeshare Information Network, where we cover all things timeshare. Whether you've owned a timeshare for years, just purchased one, or are thinking about becoming an owner, this program is for you. Now here's your moderator and co-host, Lisa Ann Schreier, the Timeshare Crusader.
Hello, and welcome to the Timeshare Information Network. I am Lisa Ann Schreier, the Timeshare Crusader, and with me today is my co-host Andrew Meyer with the Finn Law Group. We received some great feedback and a number of really interesting questions from our listeners after our first two programs, and we'll be answering as many as we can in the coming weeks. Today we're going to be discussing getting out of a timeshare contract. This is something that has been in the news a great deal. It's also been on the minds of a lot of timeshare owners. Specifically, we're going to be talking about reasons why some owners want out versus the harsh reality that timeshare contracts have been constructed in such a way that can make it very difficult to get out. Andy, what are your initial thoughts on this?
Hey, Lisa, great to be on the show again. Yes, the timeshare contract is very well written by the timeshare developer, and it's been honed over the years. Timeshare has been around for quite some time now, and so timeshare developers are versed in the objections that consumers oftentimes make to the timeshare purchase, and so they've written all kinds of contractual language in anticipation of consumer objection, and so it makes it difficult as a contractual matter to find loopholes and problems and areas to exploit in the timeshare contract on behalf of a consumer who wants out.
Right, and both Andy and myself, we hear from timeshare owners on a daily basis who want out and are looking for help. And Andy and I have kind of compiled the most often used reasons why they want out. Let me know, and open-ended questions to our listeners if any of these sounded familiar. The presentation or the sales pitch was supposed to take 90 minutes, but they kept us for 5 hours, and we just signed to get out of there. Then there's the salesperson told us we could go to Hawaii using our timeshare, but it's been 3 years and it's never available. In this time of COVID, we also hear we haven't been able to travel due to COVID, and the timeshare won't let us roll over our week to the following year. Then there's, I'm 75 or 80 or whatever, I'm old, I don't travel anymore, and my kids just don't want it. The salesperson convinced us to buy more at our last presentation, and we can't afford the maintenance fees or the monthly payments. And then there's the generic, the salesperson lied about something, and the ever-popular, the maintenance fees have gone up. I'm sure some of these, if not all of these, sound familiar to a lot of you listeners out there. Andy,
and hey, Lisa, can I add to that list? Yeah, let me add to that list real quick.
Sure.
I find also that, and this is oftentimes a little bit heartbreaking when you hear this from clients, that they've had an unexpected medical problem, either on their own behalf or their spouse or family member, and so they would love to travel, but they're just not physically able to. And so that's another problem that we hear frequently, or as a justification for people wanting to get out of the timeshare interest.
Absolutely true. Thank you. And before we talk about why these complaints may or may not have a legal basis for an owner to be released from their contract, Andy, can you briefly discuss the oral representations clause that is found in almost every timeshare contract and why it's so important as a starting point to understand getting out of a timeshare?
Absolutely. So, Lisa, it's important to remember that, at least from the timeshare developer's perspective, they view the contract that you signed with them as a legally enforceable contract. And they, if you breach it, may very well take you to court for your failure to honor up to your obligations under that contract. So it's important to understand that those documents that you signed will be governed by contract law. And of course, the specifics of contract law are complicated and something that lawyers study and depend upon the specific state that you live in. So you can't say anything categorically one way or the other, except there's certain general principles of contract law that apply pretty much universally. And one of those principles is that if you have a written document, especially if the written document itself says that the writing contains all the terms and conditions of the contract, then courts will not look beyond the four corners of that document. And this can be a real problem because, as you were mentioning earlier, Lisa, people sit in very lengthy sales presentations and sales pitches after the sales presentation is done, ask a lot of questions and get a lot of information from the timeshare sales folks. But that's not always what the documents say. There can be a mismatch between those two things. But if you're facing a judge, odds are the judge is going to be looking only to the written document. So, one final point here, timeshare developers will have you sign a piece of paper that says you are not relying upon any of the oral statements made to you prior to signing a document. And you'll have your initials by that. Of course, it'll be one of many, many documents you sign at the sales transaction, so you may not remember that particular piece of paper, but it has a lot of legal significance. It really means that whatever you were told, whatever questions were answered, it's going to be difficult for you to bring that in as a basis for breaching a contract.
So it's interesting that timeshare is still sold on for the most part, a face-to-face contact, meaning you're there for 2, 3, 4 hours listening to the salesperson talk and talk and talk. And I can say this with great experience because, as some of our listeners know, I got my start in the business as a timeshare salesperson. But you're saying the oral representations clause basically says it doesn't matter what the salesperson says. Or let me put it this way. It says that the buyer, the purchaser, is not being reliant on anything that the salesperson says or some things that the salesperson says.
Right. So it's difficult because, of course, there's principle in the law, and especially here in Florida, recognized as a fraudulent inducement claim. So somebody can't completely lie to you in an effort to get you to sign a contract, and the basis of the bargain be nothing but phony. And of course, that's how people oftentimes feel when they on the backside of a timeshare purchase. But what happens in reality is the documents you're given are voluminous. You're given stacks and stacks of documents. I like to say, we've said this before on the show, that timeshare is probably one of the most complicated, legally speaking, things that consumers purchase. There's all kinds of laws that come into play in the timeshare contract and the timeshare purchase. So, these are all the documents you're deemed to understand at the time that you do the sale. And the oral misrepresentations clause really makes it difficult for you to come back later and contradict what's in those documents. Even though they may be, 6 inches tall and you certainly couldn't have read all of them, you will be deemed to know what's in those documents. It's a difficult proposition for a consumer who's listened to a timeshare salesperson who may be answering the question, by the way, in good faith. They may not be lying to you. Maybe they're just wrong, mistaken. That happens. But it's going to be on you when you listen to that oral answer to the question and then find out later that that's not how it actually works from the timeshare company.
Wow, it's great information. I'm sure our listeners who already own a timeshare will be digging out that information in the contract and looking for that specific clause. And as Andy and I can both say, there's a world of difference between getting out of or exiting a timeshare that is paid in full and one that you still owe a mortgage or a loan on. Andy, is that right?
Absolutely, Lisa. So as we've talked about in prior shows, the timeshare product is really based, at least legally speaking, off the idea of a condominium. And so anyone who's purchased a condominium or knows anything about how condos work, you understand that you own your condo, but you also have an obligation to pay monthly maintenance fees. And those help defray the costs of the common areas, perhaps the pool or the roof that the building shares, things like that. So timeshare has a very similar structure. You purchase your timeshare interest. That may be converted into points, but that's a separate issue. But you're obligated to pay maintenance fees, usually on a yearly basis, for the upkeep of the resort, and all kinds of things get buried into that maintenance fee. But you're actually, through these documents, committing yourself to pay oftentimes two different entities. One entity is the timeshare developer that sold you the interest. You have a mortgage with them to pay off the timeshare. The other entity is the Owners Association, and that's the entity responsible for maintaining the resort where you own your timeshare. So if you owe both things, you owe on your mortgage and you owe maintenance fees, you may have to deal with two different entities. Now, as a practical matter, they're often run by the same people, and so it's only one, but legally speaking, it's two different things. And it can be, depending on the developer, easier to deal with a mortgage balance and maintenance fees, but really maintenance fees are a little bit easier, I would say, in my experience, dealing with than mortgages. Just depends. But it's important to remember that there are different entities to whom you've pledged money, and they have different interests and different desires for ever letting you out.
And then am I correct in thinking that who you owe that money to can not only affect, as we'll talk about after the break, the ability to get out of a timeshare and the ability to use the timeshare. Am I correct?
Absolutely. And I think we'll talk a little bit about this later on in the show, but it's important that when you're thinking about getting out of your timeshare, there's different ways to do that, and we'll talk about that. But, if you're a timeshare developer and you have your customer coming to you and saying, hey, I don't want to perform anymore on this contract, thinking about how much that person owes you and how much you're going to be out if they stop performing on the contract naturally is going to have a big impact on your willingness to let that person go. It only makes common sense. You owe a developer $100,000 for a timeshare and you've only paid a few $1,000, used it, that timeshare developer may have a different perspective on letting you out versus someone that's paid in full. So it's absolutely a critical component when you're thinking about trying to get out of that timeshare.
Interesting. And I found one other thing you said very interesting, that timeshare laws, at least in the state of Florida, are covered under the same sort of law that condominiums are. You would think that after being in existence for 40-plus years, they would have their own set of laws. But it's interesting that they're covered under the same condominium laws. And I flash back to when I was a salesperson and I had to get my real estate license when I took my test. There were 100 questions on the test. One of them, only one, pertained to timeshare, which I thought was interesting because 95% of the class were going into timeshare sales, and yet it was barely covered in the real estate test whatsoever. It was very interesting. So when we
and there's not
to the time,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go
Sorry,
ahead,
Lisa.
Andy.
I was just going to say there's not a lot of lawyers that specialize in this area either, even though there's a lot of people who own timeshare. It's a very big business in Florida and across the country. A lot of people are impacted, and it's a very complicated area of the law, in my opinion.
It is very complicated, as we're going to find out in a little bit. When we return to the Timeshare Information Network, we'll be discussing the various ways timeshare owners may get out from their contract and what you as an owner can do to protect yourself from the various scam artists out there.
If a tree falls in the woods and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Have you ever felt that your voice goes unheard? And you think that you can make a difference if only someone would listen. It's time for women in business to have a place to step into your power, a platform to embrace your hopes, dreams, and your visions, a voice to heal and restore. Your voice can make a difference. We have a platform you deserve to share your story and let your voice be heard. Be kind to yourself. Give yourself the chance to be heard and shine bright. Contact New Dawn Media by texting CAFE to 55312. That's CAFE to 55312. Or call us at 866-224-5422. Your voice can make a difference.
Welcome back to the Timeshare Information Network. As a reminder, the Timeshare Information Network airs live every other Monday at 6:30 p.m. in South Florida on 95.3, 96.9, 1470, and on WWNN Radio on the Beasley Network. Of course, you can listen in from anywhere by accessing those stations online. If you missed anything or want to listen again, we're also available as a podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Just look for the Timeshare Information Network. And now, back to your moderator and co-host, Lisa Ann Schreier.
Welcome back to the Timeshare Information Network. I'm Lisa Ann Schreier, the Timeshare Crusader, and with me is attorney and managing partner Andy Meyer of the Finn Law Group. Andy, can you describe, we're going to talk a little bit about various results that a timeshare owner can expect when they're looking to get out, and can you shed a little light if one is preferable to another? The way I understand it, there are several different kinds of, for lack of a better term, releases. Can you talk about some of those different kinds and if one is better than another?
Absolutely. So getting out of your timeshare, quote, exiting the timeshare can mean a number of different things, and some are probably better for you than others. So, for instance, it's an exit of a timeshare if the developer sues you in foreclosure and takes the deed through judicial action. And even in that context, there's what are called non-judicial foreclosures, where the timeshare developer uses the court system, takes the deed back, but never seeks any money from you. And that's probably a better option than a judicial foreclosure, where the timeshare developer seeks not only the interest back from you, but to have you pay them money in the form of a delinquency. But besides court process, you can, depending on the type of timeshare you own, you may be able to convince the developer to take that timeshare back from you by executing a deed. Now, other times, people will try to execute deeds on their own and try to give the timeshare back to the developer through the use of what we'll call in the law a wild deed, and that's a bad idea. Probably the most preferable one is where the timeshare developer agrees to take the deed back from you. A quitclaim deed is what it's called, or a warranty deed. That's the cleanest and best way for you to get the interest back in the hands of the developer, with the caveat, of course, that sometimes developers are using trusts as the way to hold your timeshare interest, and then that's an entirely different animal altogether. So as you can see, Lisa, it gets really thorny and tricky, even with a simple question of like, I want out, I want to exit. How do I do that? And it depends on what you own and when you bought it, who your developer is, how the product is structured. But yeah, there's also
it does. It sounds very complex, and as we're going to be talking about in a little bit, that's why it's very important to be dealing with vetted legal people, as in attorneys, when a consumer is looking to get out, because some of these self-proclaimed timeshare exit companies probably don't know the difference to those different options that you just discussed. So it's very, very important for consumers to understand that we're dealing with fairly complex legal structures here. And I want to make a note that the options that Andy and I are discussing today, we're talking about timeshares that are past the rescission period. In the United States, the rescission or the cooling off period varies from 3 to 10 days. A purchaser can change their mind within that legal rescission period. So we're talking about timeshares that are past the rescission period. And Andy, I've been advising owners to first contact their resort to see what, if any, options that the resort or the developer may or may not offer. Do you agree with that strategy, that that should be the first contact that an owner makes if they want to be out of their contract?
I do agree. That is absolutely the first strategy. Yeah, I think you should go about the problem this way. You've purchased something that, for whatever reason, and we've talked about a lot of those reasons at the top of the show, you now want to be rid of it. And the best first start of that is to contact the timeshare developer and explain your situation. And of course, it depends on what you own and who your developer is. But in some instances, they may offer options to you that make sense and that you're willing to do in order to give them back the timeshare and have a amicable resolution of your problem. And that's always the best. So that's the first step you should take. And then if that doesn't work, then look, as Lisa's saying, for some competent advice on what to do next. And, it's important also that when you approach the timeshare developer with the idea that you want out of the timeshare, to be careful, don't fall prey to renewed sales efforts, because we do hear from that happening from time to time. Someone calls in with a complaint about their timeshare, and next thing you know, they ended up upgrading or buying another one in an effort to solve whatever problem they thought they had. Maybe that's the answer for you, but I would urge you to be very cautious if you're contacting your timeshare developer because you're unhappy about the product, that the answer is more timeshare. I think you should think really long and hard before you go down that road.
Absolutely. I unfortunately, I have heard stories like that, which is very, very sad. And earlier, when I was going over some of the reasons that people give for wanting out of a timeshare, for instance, the length of the sales pitch, they promised us we could go to Hawaii. We can't go to Hawaii. Can you talk a little bit about the legal merit of some of those reasons people want out? Am I correct in assuming that if the sales presentation took 3 hours and you were only told it would take 120 minutes or 2 hours, that doesn't hold much legal water, does it?
That's right, Lisa. So the things that typically make clients the most angry are not necessarily the best legal arguments to make. So unfortunately, usually the fine print tells you that the sales presentation is going to be limited to 90 minutes or whatever it says. But the sales process is not so limited. So the timeshare developer is going to say, well, of course, I put you in a room and I showed you, a video, and we talked to you about the product, we gave you a tour, and all of that took an hour and a half. It was afterwards when you sat down one-on-one with a salesperson, that's when the sales presentation ended, and now you're in the sales process. And that's a distinction that's important. And, of course, in any event, whether that's true for you or not, it's not the best legal grounds to say to a judge, look, I went ahead and signed this very complicated legal document because they tried to explain to me how it works for 5 hours. But it's probably them trying to do their best to have you understand what it is. That would be their answer. So it's not the things typically or often that get you the most mad that are going to be the most successful. So, what we do at the FinLaw Group is we will give you a free initial consult, help you understand what you own, and help go over your options with you and see if there's other ways perhaps to help you exit that timeshare if there is no, legal basis to do so. Sometimes there can be other ways to get you out as well.
Good to know. And I know we're running out of time, unfortunately, on this show. So I want to let people know that I think on our next program, we're going to be talking about the public offering statement, also known as the POS. And we talked about the need for people to read all their information on the contract, which, as you and I both know, Andy, is impossible to do during a sales pitch. So I think we're going to save the discussion about the public offering statement and reading what you should understand in the contract for our next program. Does that sound okay with you if we hold off for our next program with that?
Yes, and we'll have an answer by then, maybe, as to what the Florida legislature is going to do this time around. There's some talk, and there's a bill currently pending up at the Florida legislature this session to amend the way that information in the public offering statement can be given to consumers, and it can really impact your ability to examine that document. But as to your point, Lisa, it's so long, lengthy, and complicated, I don't know that it really helps consumers as it was originally designed to do. I think it's a confusing document. Even as a lawyer, it takes some time to trudge through such a thing. It's not simply digested in one evening, for sure.
Absolutely. So I think it's a good idea if we save the reading of the documentation and especially the TOS for the next program. I can tell you as a former timeshare salesperson that the person asking the questions is the one in control of the sales pitch. So if you do go into a sales pitch with questions, you're much less likely to find yourself in a bad situation. So that's it for this episode of the Timeshare Information Network. If you have questions, concerns, or suggestions for a future show, we want to hear from you. You can email me at lisa@theti.net. That's lisa@theti.net. For Andy Meyer and myself, Lisa Ann Schreier, thanks for joining us. And remember to avoid anyone who uses the words free, perfect, always, and never.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Andy.
You've been listening to the Timeshare Information Network. The Timeshare Information Network airs live every other Monday at 6:30 p.m. in South Florida on 95.3, 96.9, 1470, and on WWNN Radio on the Beasley Network. We're also available as a podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Just look for the Timeshare Information Network. We'll see you next time on the Timeshare Information Network.